This is Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque. 17 years on air and online, helping you succeed in buying, selling, and investing in property. The best real estate strategies out there, just for you.
Welcome to Real Estate This Week. Hi again, I'm Stephen Gasque, and I'm so glad you're here as we share great news for home buyers. The spring market of 2026 is promising to give home buyers their best shot in years. From the number of houses for sale, to mortgage interest rates, to less competition from other buyers, it's all good. And it might be the opportunity you have been waiting for. So, let's dive in and get the facts from Danielle Hale, the Chief Economist at Realtor.com. Danielle, welcome to Real Estate This Week.
It's great to talk to you, Stephen.
It is great to talk to you too. And Danielle, tell me, first of all, why is today a good time for buyers?
Well, the housing market has some distinct advantages for buyers right now. First of all, we're seeing the number of homes on the market continue to grow. So today's home shoppers have more options than they did last year. And we're very, very slowly closing that gap to the number of homes that were on the market pre-pandemic. So that gap compared with pre-pandemic has kind of slowed down. We're not closing it at the rate that we were closing it before. But I think as we move into the spring season, we're going to get some of that momentum back in that inventory recovery. So there are definitely more homes than last year. And I think we're going to see those numbers continue to grow. And then the other big advantage for buyers in today's market is that mortgage rates are down pretty significantly from where they were a year ago. In fact, in recent weeks, they dipped below 6%. They're probably likely to pop back up above 6%, but they're very close to that 6% threshold, which is a game changer for buyer affordability. In fact, using some numbers from a recent week, the drop in mortgage rates has basically boosted buying power by almost 9%. And
Wow.
At the median home listing price, that equates to a buying power of roughly $34,000. So a buyer using the same budget as last year would have $34,000 more purchasing power because of the drop in mortgage rate.
Interesting. And you just mentioned prices. So what is happening with prices in terms of buyers in the spring market?
So we've seen some different trends in asking prices and sales prices. So asking prices have actually been flat to slightly lower to start 2026. So that suggests to me that sellers are aware that buyers have more options and they're kind of coming to the market prepared to accept the same price or maybe slightly lower because those asking prices are dropping. Interestingly, though, sales prices are still flat to slightly higher. So it really depends on where buyers are. What we're seeing so far is that homes that are coming to market are priced similarly to last year. And then the homes that are selling are still priced a little bit higher than what we saw last year. But the momentum has kind of come down for both asking prices and selling prices. So that is also a buyer-friendly development.
And Danielle, I noticed that the very first thing you referenced when I asked you about today's market and why it's good for buyers, the first thing you referenced is the supply of homes for sale. Now tell us, why is that so important to a buyer in the spring market or any market?
I think that's a great question. So I used to tell people, well, you can't buy what's not for sale. And you may work with an agent who might have a strategy to try to convince a homeowner who's in a home that you really, really love to try to sell. I mean, I'm sure you get those letters. I get those letters from time to time. But ultimately, a buyer needs a seller in order to actually make a transaction happen. So inventory is really important when we think about how many home sales we're going to see. And it's the piece of the market that has really struggled the most over the last few years. So that's why I start there.
And in some of our conversations, you have said we desperately need new construction because there's no way that the number of homes for sale from individual sellers will be enough. But has that changed? It sounds like so many people are putting their homes on the market.
It is true that we have a lot more existing homeowner sellers today than we've had over the past years. So that has taken some of the pressure off of new construction. But it's worth noting that it really depends on where you are. So in the South and in the West, builders have done a really good job of building more homes and in particular building more affordable homes. And so in those markets, we've actually seen regionally that inventory is roughly back to pre-pandemic levels, and in some markets in the South and in the West, inventory is actually above pre-pandemic levels. So Central Texas is one that comes to mind as an area where we're really looking at more homes for sale now than we had before the pandemics. They're fully recovered and then some. But in the Northeast and the Midwest, homes are still relatively scarce, down between 30 and 50% compared to what we saw before the pandemic. So we're seeing a very regionalized housing market, and the degree of inventory recovery that we see is very strongly related to how much home building we've seen over the last few years.
And Danielle, I think a lot of people are scratching their heads right now and wondering why. Why are so many individual homeowners deciding to sell? And the question that comes to mind is, has that lock-in effect gone away? I mean, the people who got the 3% mortgage interest rates and said, I will never sell this house because I have such a good rate. Has that passed?
No, but the lock-in effect has definitely improved. In fact, in the latest data, we saw that we hit a bit of a milestone in lock-in improvement, which is that there are now a greater share of homeowners with a 6% mortgage or higher than there are those that have a 3% or less mortgage. So the lock-in effect is very slowly loosening its grip on the housing market. Every bit that mortgage rates come down, that obviously makes a difference for some households because, now the market rate may be below their current rate. And so moving that might have been a big expensive proposition before might become affordable. And for others, even if the market mortgage rate is not below the rate they have on their outstanding mortgage, anytime you reduce that gap, it changes the cost for that household. And so maybe they've had a couple of kids and moving is very much something that they want to do. Maybe the mortgage rate dropping makes that possible this year when it wasn't necessarily a year ago when it was much closer to 7%. So I think that's going to unlock some households, and we'll see that. The other interesting thing that we've seen over the last year is that it was more of a 2025 story. And so I'm interested to see if we will see this story continue in 2026. I think it's debatable. But in 2025, you had a lot of sellers who decided to try listing their home for sale. And if they didn't get the price that they wanted from a buyer, then they would just delist their home. And so we had a lot of sellers in 2025 who were very patient sellers. And that's great for the seller, but not always the best thing to negotiate against if you're a buyer. It suggests that sellers are in a really good position and they don't have to sell. They're sort of flexible in their timelines. And if they're not getting the price that they want, they're just going to pull their home off the market and wait. And we may see some of those homes come back to the market this spring. And it'll be interesting to see if those sellers are still very patient and waiting for a certain price, or if they're approaching the market a little more flexibly this year. So far, asking price data suggests that maybe they're approaching a little bit more flexibly because those asking prices are flat to slightly lower. But it's too early in the year to know for sure, but that is definitely something I'm watching.
Danielle, that is so interesting because it really goes against the grain. Because every real estate professional will tell a seller, if you ask too much money, your house will just sit there. And then eventually the buyers will come in and really hit you with a super low offer. Normally, sellers would care. It sounds like some of them don't.
I think that's what the data suggested last year. And I think the reason for that is that today's homeowners are sitting on a massive amount of equity, and many of them have those low mortgage rates, or maybe they've paid off their mortgage entirely. And so they are not selling because they have a need to move right now. They have flexible timelines, and over 2025, at least, they showed an indication for being patient. And I think it'll be interesting to see if sellers approach the market in 2026 with the same patience, or if a year of waiting has led to a little more urgency on their part. We'll have to see.
I see. And Danielle, that huge pile of equity that so many homeowners have, that's changed a lot of things. For one thing, when they get into the market and decide to buy another house, they could possibly buy that house all cash and not worry about a mortgage at all. And second, with all that equity, they're in a much stronger financial position all across the board. And when it comes to interest rates, if you have a ton of equity and you have a 3% mortgage interest rate, you're not going to be as concerned about trading up to a 6% mortgage interest rate because you'll have a much smaller mortgage. It's a big factor, and we don't hear as much about that as I think we should.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not just that home values are high driving that record equity, but also a lot of homeowners have completely paid off their mortgage. We see higher shares of people who own their home outright today without any mortgage. And it does change the game for that subset of buyers. Of course, your first-time home buyers are still very often taking on a mortgage and so experiencing a very different housing market. But that's why when we talk about the housing market, it's affecting all of these different groups differently depending on what their prior homeownership experience is and whether they have that low mortgage rate or whether they're just starting from scratch and working with today's market rate. It really depends.
And so, Danielle, let's go through buyers and sellers in a changing market and explain what each can expect, beginning with buyers. If I want to buy a home in the spring market of 2026, what should I expect in terms of price, interest rates, supply of homes for sale, and competition?
Yeah, so I think because we have a lot of regionalization in the housing market, it really depends on where you are when you're shopping for a home. If you're in the Northeast and the Midwest, you're looking at a somewhat tighter real estate market, generally speaking. We are seeing more homes come up for sale. So inventory is improving, but it hasn't already improved as much as in the South and the West. And so it's very likely that you will expect to see home prices that are still going up in the Northeast and the Midwest, and perhaps a bit more competition in those markets. I think it will be less competition than we've seen in prior years, but still a little bit more competition in the Northeast and Midwest than you might experience in the South or West. So, as a buyer, it's always a good idea to, be prepared by making sure you have your mortgage pre-approval, you've got your budget really locked in, and so that you can act quickly, make sure you know what you must have versus what you can live without if you have to. If you're really dialed in on that, then you can move really quickly in the housing market in the Northeast and Midwest. You'll probably still have to. It's good to be prepared, even if you're in the South and West where the market is moving a little bit slower, but you'll probably have a little more time to make decisions in the South and the West. You'll probably have more room to negotiate with sellers and do so successfully. So it really just depends on where you are, and setting that context and expectation for the regional market that you're in, I think, is really important. And then, of course, to drill down beyond the regional level, we've got a lot of data at realtor.com/research, and you can work with your realtor agent to talk through specific strategies for your market, which I think will be really important for buyers in 2026.
And now to sellers. If I want to sell my house in the spring market, can I still expect to get a good price and have a fast sale and maybe even multiple offers? Or has that ship sailed?
Again, I think it depends on where you are, your price point within the market, and how competitive that price point is. But in general, we're seeing homes take longer to sell in 2026 relative to 2025. They're still in many places selling faster than they did before the pandemic. So this is far from the slowest real estate market we've ever seen, but it is moving more slowly than the prior year. And that's true across the board. We're seeing, in general, more homes on the market this year compared to last year. So as a seller, you've got to think more about competition. In some markets, you're back to levels of competition from other sellers, levels of inventory that exceed what was normal before the pandemic. So you really got to be mindful in parts of the South and the West. In the Northeast and the Midwest, we haven't seen as much inventory recovery. And so while we are seeing more homes for sale compared to last year, there's still relatively more seller-friendly markets in the Northeast and the Midwest. So it really just depends on where you are. But the good news for both buyers and sellers is that mortgage rates have come down. And so even though home prices remain high and affordability is still pretty stretched, we are seeing an improvement in affordability relative to a year ago. And so that means buyers will have a little bit more buying power. And you've got that increase in buying power against the increase in inventory. So there's some good for sellers. They may be able to find buyers who have more buying power, but then they might be attracted to other potential homes that would be a good fit. So they'll have to balance very carefully on how far they want to push asking prices. And that's why working with a local expert who knows what conditions are like in your market can be really helpful when setting a price.
You know, Danielle, I'm seeing some good news for buyers and sellers here because buyers have really good factors in their favor happening in the spring market of 26, from interest rates to the number of homes for sale to, in some cases, home prices and a little bit less competition. And sellers are still going to get a good price, and they're going to have a relatively quick sale, and they have a ton of equity they can use for their next house. And so there's good on both sides of the closing table, which leads me to ask, is this now a balanced market? Have we completely left the solid seller's market that has had its grip on real estate for the last 5 or 10 years?
I think this year's housing market is far more balanced than it has been. And again, the picture is very regionalized. So some metro areas and housing markets still are seller friendly. You will predominantly find those in the Midwest and the Northeast. Other housing markets have moved beyond balance into buyer-friendly territory. Those are predominantly in the South and in the West. So as much as people hate this answer from an economist, it really depends. And in this case, it very much depends on where you are.
Well, that's fair. And Danielle, I really want to thank you for being on the show today and telling us all about what buyers and sellers alike should expect in the spring market of 2026. Danielle, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
You are very welcome. Danielle Hale, the Chief Economist at Realtor.com. Next time on Real Estate This Week, a fascinating look at investing in real estate in a foreign land. We'll talk to an expert about what it takes to buy not just a house, but a whole resort in the Caribbean. How's that sound? That's next on Real Estate This Week. And until then, I'm Stephen Gasque. And thank you for listening.
A brand new episode of Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque drops every Thursday, everywhere. And you're invited to listen, subscribe, and follow us. Just look for Real Estate This Week with Stephen Gasque. The best real estate strategies out there, just for you.